Matt, if I can pass it on to you to introduce Special Agent Michael DiNicola, who has his presentation ready to go. Thank you, and I'll speak to everybody at the end of the presentation. You will be allowed to ask questions. I do ask when you're not speaking to keep yourselves on mute. Thank you. Matt, take it away.
Good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining. We're really excited for this presentation. We've been kind of tossing around this idea for a cybersecurity presentation for over a year. And given the timeliness of this, everyone's working from home, and if there's more cybersecurity risk now than we've seen out there in the past, operationally, I'm sure all your banks, law firms, and you're all dealing with this. So Special Agent Michael DiNicola, he joined the FBI in 2015. He's assigned to the cyber division in the New York field office, where he investigates financially motivated crimes, cyber crimes. He's been doing this for the last 5 years. He also has, been involved in some, hacks of major financial institutions, has worked on subsequent theft of data, operations of unlicensed cryptocurrency exchange, and development of various exploit kits that are made available for purchase and use by other would-be criminals. He has a great wealth of knowledge, and I think he can kind of help all of you, some of your day-to-day issues that maybe you're dealing with, and some of the bigger, larger issues that your customers might face. So, Michael, I'm happy to have you join us, and welcome.
Well, I appreciate the introduction, Matt, and I also appreciate the invitation to speak to you guys today. Cyber is one of those topics that certainly is prevalent in the news. Most folks are aware of, but I also know it can be a bit scary or overwhelming, particularly if you may not have a technical background. My goal today is just to kind of at a very high level go over some common threats that are out there, give some general pointers in terms of how to protect yourself. Cyber is one of those topics that you could easily spend hours or days getting into the details. Certainly that's not the plan or the goal today, but we will keep it open for questions at the end. If you do have specific issues or questions that you want to kind of discuss, there will be an opportunity to do that. So just kind of generally the way the presentation will go, I'll talk, like I said, high level about some of the typical schemes. Certainly this is not intended to be an exhaustive list, but I tried to focus on the threats that are most prevalent to many of your businesses that are out there. Like I said, this is not intended to be kind of an exhaustive list. And then talking through those, we'll talk a little bit about some specific cases that I've worked in and kind of how some of these threats materialize. And then some pointers on practices and procedures that you can put in place to protect yourself. As most folks have said, this topic is certainly very timely because as our kind of world and working environment has shifted in many cases from an in-person office work environment to a remote work from home environment, the cyber threats certainly are something to take very seriously. They always have been, but in today's environment, that's even more so. What I'll say is that from what we see in the FBI, there's certainly been an increase in activity, but a lot of what we're seeing is not necessarily specific to work from home or any of the, operating environments that might be in use today. Really what it's done is just created some additional opportunities. The types of schemes are generally the same. They certainly may take a bit of a different flavor based on what's going on in the world around us. But a lot of the tactics and things remain the same. It's just there may be a few more opportunities to take advantage or leverage those exploits. So with that being said, the three things that we'll really discuss today are ransomware, business email compromise, or what's called BEC, and then a category that we like to call cyber-enabled fraud, which may not necessarily be a direct like hacking or cyber incident, but it leverages some of the same techniques to basically execute overall fraudulent schemes. I'd say that these three categories are some of the most prevalent cyber threats affecting companies nationwide. As I mentioned, certainly this is not intended to be an exhaustive list, but these are the three big ones that we see a lot of activity in today. And these span every industry, but I would say that as we'll discuss, we definitely see a lot of activity in the financial, real estate, legal services industries. So next slide, please. Ransomware. I would imagine many of you have heard of it at a very basic level. Ransomware is essentially encryption. It is when an unauthorized person or criminal without authorization goes into a network and encrypts all the files, which effectively prevents you from accessing those files. The bad guys have a key, and they offer to provide that key so a company can access the files again, only with the payment of a ransom. Ransom payments vary widely in terms of amount, as low as a few $1,000s. I've seen them as high into the millions of dollars. As you might imagine, data access to files is essentially the lifeblood for many organizations. And so without that kind of access, it can be very crippling to an organization. I will say that at the FBI, we do not recommend paying of ransoms. The reason being is just continues to provide an incentive for criminals to perpetuate these attacks. But we have worked with a variety of companies that have been victim to ransomware, some of which have not paid the ransom, some of which have. That is an individual organizational decision. And we recognize that businesses and organizations need to do what they feel is best. So I say that because while we do have some general guidance, we recognize that, you know, you guys have businesses to run, and we try to the extent that's possible to kind of stay out of the way, so to speak. So if you go to the next slide, this is just an example of a typical ransom note that you might see. So with these ransomware attacks, often what happens is somebody comes in, they logs onto the network, they go to pull up a file, and they see some weird file extensions that look unusual, and the only thing that is able to be accessed from that network would be a ransom note like this. The ransom notes take, you know, several different flavors. They're all a little bit different, but some common themes. Most of them require some kind of payment, typically in cryptocurrency. Bitcoin is one of the prominent ones. They basically are going to explain that if you pay the ransom, they will provide a key that will allow you to decrypt the files. In many cases, the key does in fact work. In some cases, it may not. So there is some amount of risk there. But I would also say that many of these ransom notes, at least that I've reviewed, also include some kind of contact information. And so one of the surprising things that I've come across is that many of these criminal organizations affecting ransomware do actually have some semblance of customer service to try to facilitate payment of ransoms. So if you go to the next slide, like I said, we see organizations hit with ransomware attacks very, very frequently. And they really range, there's a very wide spectrum of how damaging one of these attacks can be to your organization. So if an organization is not very well prepared, you can go from the worst case scenario, which would be total unrecoverable data loss. And I don't need to explain to the folks here how damaging that would be to the organization. In many cases, that would mean a complete cease of operations. We've seen how damaging some of these attacks can be. A couple of years ago, the WannaCry ransomware attack took a lot of healthcare institutions and hospitals offline. There's been several other campaigns that have really affected a large number of victims globally. And as you'll see here, that for many small and medium-sized companies, a complete and total unrecoverable data loss, they would never be able to recover from that. If you're even in the best case scenario, if an organization is unprepared, they choose to pay the ransom, they may be able to recover the files, but as I mentioned, these are criminals we're dealing with, and so it wouldn't be surprising if they weren't the most reliable in terms of delivering what they said. But even if you were able to get the key and recover the data, what you've done now is proven to a criminal that your network is vulnerable to this type of attack. You are willing and able to pay a ransom payment. And if there's no additional remediation or addressing of the vulnerabilities that led to the attack in the first place, you could be victimized again. So in many cases, you become a prime target now to a criminal organization. However, I will say with ransomware, prevention definitely goes a long way, and we're going to talk in a little bit about ways to prevent this type of attack. But at the end of the day, with proper preparation, you can really minimize the damage from even if you were to become victim of a ransomware attack. In that case, with proper preparation, the systems may go down for a short amount of time, but if backups are in place and there has been a data recovery plan that is in place and practiced, it's not unreasonable to think that even with a complete loss of access to data, and the systems may go down for a period of time, we've seen many organizations able to repopulate the data and recover and return back to normal operations in a relatively short amount of time. Certainly a lot of work goes into that, and I'm not going to minimize the disruption that would have on a business, but it doesn't necessarily have to mean that it would be completely crippling in the same way it would be if the organization was not prepared. So in terms of preparation, really the key is to make sure that data is backed up at an appropriate frequency. Frequency of backups really is going to be dependent on the type of data and the value of that data to the organization, how damaging it might be if that data was not available. But as I mentioned before, in addition to backing up, there should really be a plan in place for how to repopulate that data or how to recover it from the backups. Many organizations have the data backed up, but they've never really reviewed how that data would be repopulated from the backups. And so there really should be a good plan in place for that. If you go to the next slide, I think we're going to spend most of our time today talking about BEC, business email compromise. And the reason for that is in many cases, that is the vector, or that is the mechanism by which cybercrime is facilitated. So for example, a ransomware we just spoke about, in many cases, the encryption software that it locks up the files is delivered through email. Email is so prevalent in business applications, and it is, in many cases, it can be a very easy way to basically kick off additional cyber criminal activity that we spend a lot of time and focus on emails and email compromises. So, this is a slide, it basically talks about the vectors and compromise systems. Very simply, business email compromise is a compromise to an email account. That can be because somebody hacks into an email account. In many cases, it's as simple as a hacker or a cyber criminal buying credentials, username and password. It could be a criminal is able to guess somebody's password. It's surprising to me how many passwords are very common, very easy to guess. We'll talk a little bit later about passwords specifically. But when we talk about an email compromise, just keep in mind that it doesn't necessarily mean that it's a very technically sophisticated hacker who's spending months on end trying to hack into a particular account. While that does occur, far more common are some of these other methods. The additional piece to business email compromise is that it doesn't necessarily even require a hack at all. It can just be an impersonation or a spoofing of an email account to get somebody to execute something through email because they think that the person sending the email is somebody that they're not. Moving on to the next slide. The primary targets. First and foremost, I'll say this: everybody is a target, because the one thing I've learned in 5 years of investigating cybercrime is that cyber criminals are very good at identifying opportunities for exploitation, and if they have access to an email account, they can be very creative in how to leverage that access for financial gain. And it may not always come up in obvious ways. That being said, there are certain industries that are primary targets for this kind of activity. And these probably are not going to come as a surprise. But we see this, a lot of this activity targeted to folks in real estate, legal services, business to business commerce, because people in those industries are generally involved in large dollar financial transactions or other types of deals that represent opportunity for large financial gain. So I point those out. Again, that likely does not come as a surprise to anybody. But even though we do see a lot of activity targeted to those sectors, it is important just to keep in mind that everybody is a target. And cyber criminals are very good at leveraging access to email accounts. So moving on, just to kind of underscore kind of how big of a problem this is and why we spend time talking on it. You'll notice the data is a little bit old here, but it's really just meant to kind of illustrate the scale of the problem related to compromises in email accounts. Over a 5-year period, from 2013 to 2018, our estimates are that the global exposure to this issue was about $12.5 billion. And just in 2 years, 2017 and 2018, there was just under $3 billion of financial exposure. And those numbers have just continued to increase for a variety of reasons. That is partly due to some of the current issues going on in the world today, with more remote work, with fewer people in the office. Not surprisingly, there's more and more being done through email communication and other forms of communication that provide opportunities for exploitation. So moving on. Just again to kind of underscore things particular to the real estate industry. And again, real estate is not the only target here. But some of the reasons it becomes a prime target is that real estate transactions represent high dollar value transactions. There are multiple parties involved in a transaction. There are emotional connections to these transactions. They include detailed information. Real estate here is an example for purposes of discussion, but I would say that these factors, while they do exist in real estate transactions, if any of those factors exist in a transaction, it becomes a prime target for exploitation. As I mentioned before, cyber criminals are very good, they're very creative, but they are also very patient. So in many cases, once they're able to access something like an email account, they'll just monitor the email traffic for, in some cases, months on end, just waiting for an opportunity to come along to insert themselves and kind of conduct a fraudulent transaction or initiate a fraudulent transaction. So moving on, we'll just round out the real estate topic. You can just see, again, not to dwell on the specific numbers, the numbers are increasing over time. This is the number of victims. And then if we go to the next slide, you can see a dollar value in terms of the scale of the problem. If we move to the next slide, just the losses are pretty significant. We do see ebbs and flows, but over time, the numbers continue to go up. And that's true of the real estate sector, but it's also true of many other industries as well. So as part of kind of these business email compromises, another big component of that are kind of what we call mules, or the individuals who are moving the money. And I bring this up particularly when I talk about groups that include people that work in financial services companies or banks or other financial institutions, because in many cases, the people who are recruited to move money may not even realize that they are moving money for a criminal organization. A lot of times these folks are recruited on social media, legitimate job boards, sometimes fake job boards. We've seen radio advertisements, romance scams, and essentially the method is the same. Somebody may be replying to what they think is a legitimate work from home scam, and they're given kind of menial tasks that don't really mean anything, and then they're asked to deposit money and then transfer that to a different account. Romance scams. An individual may meet somebody online pretending to be, a single person. Over the internet, there's a relationship that forms, and all of a sudden that the criminal actor will ask the romantic interest to transfer a large sum of money. And oftentimes, they're even, the victims are provided a fraudulent check. So it appears to be somewhat legitimate. So like I said, I bring this up with folks who work in financial companies because often people are moving this money through these institutions, and they may not even realize they're facilitating criminal activity. And so one of the things that we always try to suggest, and this again is not a surprise, you see these with anomalies. So a user or a client, or even a business for that matter, who's not used to sending large wires to international banks or foreign banks. That comes up pretty frequently with these fraudulent scams. And so having a way to kind of audit those transactions and really flag those transactions for potential fraud is important. So what's facilitating the growth, and again, we'll kind of at the end tie this to some of the current issues related to the pandemic, but if we move on to the next slide, there are a couple of things that are facilitating this. One, these days, hacking is easier than you might think. There are a lot of automated tools out there that a relatively inexperienced individual can download either from the dark web market or even some clear web areas, forums, message boards. A lot of these tools are used for legitimate purposes like penetration testing of a network. They can also be used by a criminal actor to try to gain unauthorized access to a network. So these days, it can be quite easy with little experience to download tools that might allow you to implement some of these hacking tools. And so the number of people who are engaging in this kind of activity continues to grow. Another reason is that personal information is cheap. It's quite surprising to me how much information on individuals is out there through social media, through legitimate business intelligence companies, just from previous hacks. So information is cheap, it's available, it's readily accessible. This is important because it gives a cyber criminal who has a little bit of know-how, it provides a list of prime targets. So it's not difficult to find, let's say, people who work at banks, who work as title agents for title companies. Those are going to be very attractive prime targets for a cyber criminal. And the more information that you have about an individual, the easier it is to gain access to something like an email account, whether it's because some of that information can be used to guess a password or to kind of pretend that you are that user of that email account, or because you might be able to socially engineer your way into somebody's email account. And again, social engineering is a very prominent aspect of almost every cyber investigation that I've worked. And so we'll talk a little bit about that again later. Moving on, this again just kind of tells you some of the common places where criminals can get lists of targets. I worked one case regarding a business email compromise, and the criminal group actually was able to hack into a prominent business intelligence firm. They just got a list of people who worked in financial services or served as CFOs or other finance-related positions, and they simply used that list to spoof email accounts for those employees. Some of which were pretty obvious to tell were spoofs. Others were much harder. So just keep in mind that with just a rich data set, or with just some information about somebody's name, where they work, what their position is, a cyber criminal may be able to spoof an email and execute something like a fraudulent transaction. Next slide. The other aspect, and this is particularly relevant today, as I mentioned before, email is so ubiquitous in business today. It provides tremendous opportunity for exploitation, whether it's some of the examples here, student debt relief, debt consolidation, student loans, real estate transactions, as kind of brought up earlier today, PPP loans, other disaster recovery loans. A lot of communications in today's day and age for those large financial transactions occur through email. And that's why it becomes such a prime target for cyber criminals, and access to an email account is so attractive to a cyber criminal. Moving on. That really ties in with what we would call cyber-enabled fraud. So it may not necessarily involve a computer hack, but it leverages computers and what's done on computers to perpetuate a fraudulent scheme. So, for example, I was involved with a case regarding PPP fraud. It wasn't necessarily the criminal hacked into a financial institution, manipulated data in a back-end system in order to execute the fraud. It was the attacker obtained personally identifying information of both a business and the business employees, created fraudulent or fake PPP loan applications, spoofed or forged an email address and sent email traffic that appeared to be coming from a particular source, and through that scheme was actually successful in getting a loan dispersed to a criminal bank account. So a scenario like that, it doesn't really involve what would typically be viewed as a cyber crime or a hack per se, but it's kind of how all of the pieces fit together. That particular case didn't involve an overall kind of a takeover of an email account. It was just, in that case, spoofed. But that type of attack becomes much, much easier if you're able to access somebody's actual email account. So fraud in emails often go hand in hand. So I just figured, kind of walking through some real world examples of cases that I've worked might be helpful for the group. Now, some of these apply to the threats we discussed. Some of them are just opportunities for me to kind of talk about some general cybersecurity kind of good hygiene practices. So victim network number one. The IT department learned that a large number of email accounts had password reset requests, and those reset requests were associated from the same IP address. In many cases, the password resets occurred after a number of failed attempts to log in, and this particular account, the email system of this particular organization required like a challenge question to reset the password. The bottom line, the password resets were in fact requested by a criminal actor. That criminal actor was actually successful by using the password reset functionality to access email accounts. And from access to email, the attacker was able to gain access to other areas of the victim network. So I think that's an important point, that in addition to kind of the risks associated by somebody using an email account that's not theirs, keep in mind that access to email may also provide access to other areas of a network, whether it's credentials that are sent by email to some unrelated system, or just network connectivity to the email server. But the other particular relevant point in this case was that in addition to the organizational assets, this particular criminal was able to access the personal accounts of individual users on the network, both bank accounts, other social media accounts, and access to those accounts just kind of resulted in other further criminal activity. So as I mentioned, in this particular instance, the organization would only do a password reset if the user was able to successfully answer what's called a challenge question or security question. Unfortunately, in this particular instance, the security questions were rather general. I think, if I'm not mistaken, one of them was your favorite color. But the other issue was that you could attempt to answer that question as many times as you needed to get it right. So that was a really bad combination. And what the criminal was able to do is essentially guess the correct answer to the security question. Now, that's probably not surprising given the type of question, somebody's favorite color. But the other thing to keep in mind is that particularly in today's age of social media and how much information is out there, it can be surprisingly easy to guess the answer of a question that may appear to be somewhat obscure. For example, mother's maiden name. By looking at somebody's social media account and who else they may be connected to, it's often not difficult to come up with a very short list of potential names that would successfully answer that question. Your childhood school, childhood best friend. These are all questions I've seen being used. And I'm not here to suggest that you should or should not use those questions specifically. What I am trying to point out is that in many cases, given the amount of information that's out there, for individual users. In many cases, information that we publicly put out there ourselves, though the answers to those questions are often not as difficult to guess as you might think. So moving on, we'll talk about victim number two. Victim number two was a financial institution. The attacker had identified a website that was popular with the employees of that particular financial company. The attacker was able to access and hack into that unrelated website and obtain usernames and passwords. The passwords were encrypted, but the attacker was able to crack at least one password. When we talk about cracking, we're essentially meaning break the encryption and figure out what somebody's password is. There again, with today's computing power and tools that are available to assist in cracking of passwords, it's surprisingly easy, especially when a password is not secure, to crack a password, even if it's encrypted. With the username and the password, in many cases, people reuse passwords. So in this particular case, the attacker then was able to access the victim employee's work email because the password was the same as the one stolen from the unrelated website. And here again, by accessing and reviewing emails, the attacker identified other ways to access other aspects of the network, which did contain sensitive information. In this particular case, I'll bring up an unrelated investigation that I worked, which was a hack into a large financial institution. And a hacker did maintain access to some very sensitive areas of the network and did exfiltrate data. The data was really just username, or not usernames, but names and passwords of clients. Nothing sensitive other than that. No financial information was stolen. No accounts were depleted of funds. But what the reason that this particular data set was so attractive is it was being used to send marketing materials related to a stock manipulation scheme. So the hacker, the logic was that clients of this particular financial institution were more likely to invest, and they may be more likely to respond to marketing material that was related to a stock manipulation scheme. I bring that up just to underscore one of the things I've learned in my experience is that cyber criminals are very smart. They're very creative in figuring out ways to monetize access. And they're also, in addition to, in some cases, being very technically capable, they are often very smart about understanding how processes work, which are often very bureaucratic and complex, whether that is understanding the inner workings of investing and stock trading in order to execute a manipulation scheme, or doing their research and understanding the nuances of something such as a PPP loan program. I'm often surprised because the criminals often understand these systems in greater detail than we do. And it can be difficult sometimes staying on top of these new programs and things that are put out there. But rest assured, cybercrime is a full-time job for a lot of these cyber actors, and they take their time to do the research. Moving on, we'll talk about another financial institution, Network 3. In this case, an employee was required to review customer paperwork in the course of normal job duties. Paperwork contained PII, personally identifiable information, which for most financial institutions, I mean, that's pretty much all paperwork. The employee was actually taking this information and providing it to a criminal ring who was using it to create false identities of the victims and then execute further crime and fraud, such as taking over their accounts and using those identities for other financial crimes. So I bring this up because of a couple things. One, the employee had legitimate access to this information as part of the job duties. So a lot of monitoring and auditing that was going on in the network wasn't capturing anything unusual. What this individual was doing was using a cell phone to take photos of the paperwork, which was then being sent to the criminal group. I bring that up to kind of just touch on this point that when it comes to cyber security, I think a lot of times kind of the natural tendency is to think the most effective way to address cybersecurity is with a technical solution. And I'm certainly not going to say that's a bad thing to do or a bad way to look at it. But often in my experience, what becomes an afterthought or a second thought is kind of employee activity. So in this particular case, there was really no technical solution. There was no auditing that was going to capture this criminal activity. This is something that would have been very difficult to catch. And I would say that in my experience, that is often case the most damaging cyber actor is the insider. And sometimes that gets lost in the shuffle. Because in news media and reporting, most of the crimes that are well publicized and known involve hackers who come in from outside the network. And it's easy to overlook in a cybersecurity policy or I guess, procedures, the threat posed by an insider. So just keep that in mind, that some of these criminal activities can't necessarily be completely prevented or minimized with purely technical solutions. So moving on, to kind of tie all of this together, we're now living in the world of a pandemic. And that, I would say, has not necessarily changed the types of schemes that we see, but it has, one, created some new and interesting opportunities for exploitation, and it has kind of changed the flavor a little bit of how these schemes are executed. So the first point I'll make is just rest assured that each FBI field office has established a coronavirus task force to address the threat specific to the pandemic. We have seen an increase in cyber activity. We've seen that especially related to phishing and spear phishing. So phishing is essentially an attack that's leveraged through distribution of emails. Phishing is basically an email that is trying to get a user to take some kind of action, whether that is to fraudulently wire funds, click on a link that may have some malware, or provide additional access to that email account to the attacker. And then spear phishing, which is a very targeted type of phishing, where a cyber criminal is really identifying either a single individual or a very small group of individuals and really creating a very tailored and carefully crafted message. So one of the things that became much more prevalent in the world of COVID are these email attacks that purported to have information relating to the pandemic. I've seen emails from criminals that had attachments that appeared to be from the World Health Organization and containing important information related to COVID-19. So as you might imagine, a user who wasn't maybe thinking very carefully, there's a lot of motivation to open that email, click on the attachment, because that information that the email purported to have is so valuable or important to people. So certainly phishing and spear phishing is not unique to the pandemic. It's been around for a long time. I will say that I'm old enough to remember the days where fraudulent emails were pretty easy to spot. They were usually poorly written. It was pretty clear when you read through them that English was not the primary language of the writer, it was relatively easy to spot with a little bit of awareness. I will tell you that those emails, those types of emails still exist. people still do fall for them, but far more common these days are very well-written emails. They appear to be legitimate, it's in many cases very difficult to differentiate between a legitimate email and an illegitimate email. And I say that not to scare everybody, but just understand that the nature of the cyber criminal has changed. And not only is a cyber criminal very sophisticated technically, but in many instances, the criminals are very sophisticated in understanding how businesses operate. And that then is used to exploit users. Certainly that was the case with COVID-19. So individuals now are using that because they know people are vulnerable, because they want that information. Similarly, as I mentioned, in addition to just the straight up fraud that we've seen with PPP and other loan assistance programs, attackers understand that these loan programs are in some cases the only thing that may keep a business afloat. And so it